Hey everybody, just set up some really cool stuff in Wwise using Wwise Midi, and I wanted to share the process of how I got it in there and why I did it the way I did it. So, Wwise does have a robust MIDI system, but it's kind of a pain to set up. What I did is first mock it up in Ableton because that's super easy. So I got the BPM ramping up here over time while the pitches stay the same. And this cue plays. And over time, it speeds up. Until it eventually comes to a close. So why don't I just bake that in? Well, because in my particular circumstances, the amount of time this track will be is variable. So I need a solution that can scale to multiple amounts of time while maintaining pitches. And that is the perfect candidate for using MIDI to solve your musical trouble. So what I did is I took that musical idea and I set it all to the same BPM, because that's how Wwise likes to work, is one static BPM per segment. So I got it at 125. I've got the track ready to go, consolidated and named. And then you export your MIDI clip. You name it appropriately and put it in a folder that you can find later, because this is what you'll be bringing into Wwise, that MIDI file. And do the same for this one. MIDI export. Now, what you need to know about your track is the lowest and highest note. So I know my track well, and I know this is the lowest and highest note, which is F# 5 and B1. So I need notes that cover that range using fifths. So I could go C2 up to G5 or B1 up to F# 5. And that will cover them. So that's what I do, is I go up in fifths and I prepare my samples. So I've got my MIDI exported, then I go and do my sample preparation. And let me just make sure Bandicamp is not messing up, because it's been messing up on me and I'm not doing this again. Okay, so I set up my samples to go from B1 up to B4, which should cover as well up a fifth to the F#. So I've got all my samples spaced out so that you can hear the baked in tail doesn't overlap each other, and I can cut out the silence in between them. And same with the clock. So they play and there's space in between them and all is well. So I export those as audio, and I don't do my prep in Ableton naming and exporting wise because it's terrible at it. I do that in Reaper. So I've got my MIDI, that's good. I've got my raw audio with all the files, and so I go into Reaper. Now in Reaper, what's really cool is you can drag in your file and it'll look like this. It's got all your files on one. But you can hit D and do a dynamic split and set your points and set your history, which is when it comes back, and there you go. So this will chop it up into different slices. And I added a fade pad, which adds these fades, which is fantastic. So I already did that, and then you go through and you name each one based on their root. And I know I did fifths, so it will be B, F#. This one will be B2. Ah, shock. Yep. And you do that for all of them. Then you go through, and for your drum rack, in my case is the clock, it's C, C#, D, D#, just like a regular sort of drum kit would be on a pad. So I have them all set to regions, and I use an action called create regions from selected items. It's just a nice way of managing your regions and seeing everything in one place, because when you do lots of bounces, that's very important. So you can do the region render matrix, but go to the region manager. This is where you see all the names and everything just is very clear. So you can set them to the master mix. Now when I do my render and I use region wildcard, everything's going to be named exactly like the region to the exact region lengths. Super awesome for sample prep. And you can see that every root node is appended to the file name. Boy, is that important. And you're going to find out why right now. So 48K, 16, stereo, because my samples are stereo, is fine in this case. So we have the MIDI. We have the samples. Now we need to pull it into Wwise and make it all work. So first things first, set up a container. In this case, it's a music segment. And drag in your MIDI files. I set up the BPM to 125 because I prepped my file to 125. And when you drag in the MIDI, look at that. Ready to go. 2 MIDI files. Set your start, set your exit. Your entry cue and your exit cue. And now you have MIDI, but it's not pointing to any sounds. It won't play anything until you set up your instruments. Now this is the tough part. And I'm going to make sure that this is not going to give me any more white noise. So you have to manually set up your sampler. You set up your sampler using those instruments. And in this case, it is the clock and the melody. So I use blend containers and the sounds inside those blend containers. Consider the blend container just the top of your sampler. It's what holds your samples. And these individual samples are just named as such. So these are your wave samples. What you have to do is assign them to MIDI notes. And this is the key part. MIDI key map editor. You can get there using the MIDI key map editor here or up there. But this is the essential part. Set the MIDI tracking root notes to whatever you name them and hit enter. When you're done, you can organize by any of these columns. Don't forget that. That'll save your life. So now you have them in order. Then you set your key range min and max. That's how far they'll trigger from the root. Well, that's when they will play when struck by a MIDI note. Yes. In this case, it's a drum rack style, so it's only C1 that you want to hear that first one, and only C#1 that you want to hear this one, and vice versa. So for drum racks, you only want 1 note per sample. But for the melody, these are different. And again, I'll go to the MIDI key map editor, double click it. So set all your root notes, and if you can't, you have to overwrite MIDI and then enable, and then manually type it in for each one. Once you've manually typed it in, I recommend sorting it as such. Then you have to set your key range. And since I did it up in fifths, your general key range will be a third above and below to cover any gaps in between those fifths. And so you can see this B will cover down to the G sharp below it and up to the D above it. And then the F sharp will go down to the D sharp below it and up to the G above it. And you know, you could adjust that however you see fit, but this sounds great to me. So around a third, spreading it out as you go up, making sure that the lowest note will cover the lowest note of your piece and the highest note will cover the highest note of your piece. That's absolutely essential, or the darn thing won't play. So be sure you cover that. Now you've got a blend container with all your samples for your drums and a blend container for all your melody samples. There would be additional steps here. If you had any looping sounds or any long sounds or held sounds, I don't. These are play and forget it sounds. So normally you'd have to set up ADSR, envelopes, set up the loop points in the editor, and you do that by going into here and adjusting your crossfades. But I don't have to do any of that because, well, I don't have any loops. So if I had loops, I'd have to do something like that. But since these don't loop and I don't have held samples, I don't need to worry about it. Beyond the scope of this. So I've got my instruments. I need to instance limit them because these are individual notes that play every time they're struck within the given key range. That can get out of control, especially as fast as I play it later. So just to be safe, I instance limited the root of the sampler, the blend container, to 5 per game object. So no more than 10 will play at any given time, and it'll kill the oldest, which sounds good in context. So I've got my MIDI and my samplers, but they're not talking yet. So how do I get them to talk? You have to go to the MIDI tab, override the parent, and choose the instrument sampler, the blend container that you want it to play from. So I've hooked the MIDI clock to the MIDI clock, and I've hooked the MIDI from the melody to the sampler for the melody. And now I can hit play on this MIDI track and use the RTPC that's linked to playback speed to control the speed of the MIDI, which will play through the sampler. Won't affect the pitch of the samples themselves. It will only affect the speed of the MIDI messages being transmitted to the instrument, achieving the original goal. And let's hear how that sounds. Hooray! So it all works. That's how you can go through the whole process of going through Ableton, writing a track, mocking it up, bouncing the MIDI for preparation in Wwise, bouncing the samples, editing and prepping the samples in Reaper, pulling it all into Wwise, hooking it up, and making awesome things happen using samplers, blend containers, instruments, and MIDI and RTPCs in Wwise. Hope that shows you the possibilities and is very useful for you.